Welcome back to Beyond the Mask. Today's episode pulls back the curtain on a growing force that's quietly yet powerfully reshaping patient care, private equity. Our guests are calling this one Profits Over Patients, exposing the impact of private equity in healthcare. Joining us are two voices who are no strangers to the podcast, Daniel King and Jen Banek. Both are seasoned clinicians, thought leaders, and fierce advocates for transparency and accountability in healthcare. Today, we'll examine how private equity ownership is changing the landscape of anesthesia and beyond. Is the drive for profit compromising care? This conversation is urgent, unfiltered, and eye-opening, and we're grateful to have Daniel and Jen back to lead it.
CRNA Financial Planning is a sponsor of Beyond the Mask podcast. Investment advice offered through Private Advisor Group. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Plus, did you know listening to our podcast can earn you Class B credits? For details on how to submit, visit the CE credit section at beyondthemaskpodcast.com. Welcome to Beyond the Mask, innovation and opportunities for CRNAs and advanced practice nurses, with certified financial planner Jeremy Stanley and CRNA Sharon Pierce. Jeremy Stanley has worked with CRNAs for more than 23 years, and Sharon Pierce is a former president of the AANA and the NCANA. Join us as we leave the operating room and learn the latest in the CRNA and advanced practice nurse industries. Beyond the Mask starts in 10, 9, 8,
7. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us back.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like we've been here before.
That, it seems like it was yesterday, right?
It really does.
Feels just like yesterday.
Feels like just like yesterday.
Imagine that. Thanks so much.
Yes. Well, we're taping at the ANA meeting in Nashville, which has been a great time, and we appreciate you guys carving out a little bit of time for us on the show here. So for our listeners who might not know you guys, which I don't know who that would be at this point, but Jen, why don't we start with you? You just give us a little bit about your background, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Jeremy. So my name is Jen Banek. I am a CRNA in Illinois. I also have a unique position serving as the elected Lake County coroner.
Thanks, Jen. And my name's Daniel. I am a resident of Chicago, Illinois, where I work as a clinician educator. Been practicing for about 10 years, and I love what I do. Importantly, I have some prior leadership experience in an organization that was owned by private equity, and all the information that we'll be sharing with you about those experiences today are non-privileged pieces of information because this is a growing public problem.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that too, because I think that will make a difference in our conversation today. So Daniel, for our listeners who might not have a business background, don't really understand private equity, why don't you break it down just a little bit, and then we'll kind of lead into private equity coming into healthcare.
Yeah, it's a good question because when you're in the business of caring for people, you know a lot about medicine and patient care, but it necessitates a knowing about how these businesses run. And so for me, it's been quite a challenge to understand this as well. But private equity essentially is going to pool capital from investors to buy up companies. Often that is borrowed money, whether it's public pensions or private investor funds. And the goal is to resell within a very short period of time, usually 3 to 7 years, a few years, to turn around a profit. So in healthcare, that can typically mean buying up hospitals or practices. We call these platform practices because they typically are those that are working well initially or have really strong projected trends over time. In the process, they're going to consolidate resources in the form of staff, equipment, delay maintenance, and really push volume to make sure there's a return on that investment.
I mean, I think that's a great explanation, and I think you've kind of broken that down in layman's terms, which is really good. You know, Jen, why can this be dangerous in healthcare?
Daniel talked about his relation to private equity. So I, too, as a anesthesia clinician, worked for an entity in Lake County that was owned by private equity. I'm no longer employed there at this time. And again, all of the information is publicly available. But one of the vulnerabilities of these arrangements is that, as Daniel mentioned, private equity has a duty to investors. And so their obligation is to earn profit for their investors. And what I have found is in direct contradiction to that is that we have patients on the other end of that are coming to a facility for care. and they're not healthcare providers. And so the care that we provide is driven by the supplies and the staffing models that are used. And so it really creates quite a conundrum that frankly puts safety at risk.
Yeah, Jen, that's a really good point because, being in the financial industry, one of the things that we're always concerned about is our fiduciary duty to our client. In private equity, the client is the investor. So they really have that fiduciary duty to the investor, not necessarily to the patients. And I think that's a key point right there as well. So what are some of the flags that providers should look for if they happen to be working or thinking about working for a firm that is backed by PE?
Well, I would like to share one of the first red flags you might see is just sudden leadership turnover or corporate restructuring. So one of my dear colleagues who I was my predecessor in the chief CRNA role in the system had called this the Eddie Haskell effect. So we all know Eddie Haskell from Leave It to Beaver, and we know what his traits were, right? So he was known for being very overly polite and charming, but also a little manipulative and self-serving behind the scenes. So really smooth talking, always working an angle. And in healthcare, they can show up saying all the right things, like we value our clinicians. They tend to overpromise up front, while behind the scenes, they could be cutting staff, outsourcing services, and making decisions that erode care. And these are individuals who may actually have no clinical background at all and be pretty new to the role, but that's exactly what these systems want. So big phrases to look out for are things like efficiency or streamlining, and what that really means is being fast, cutting corners. And so if you hear those phrases like right sizing the workforce or aligning incentives or monetizing care pathways, you might just have an Eddie Haskell in your C-suite.
I think that's really interesting because, Daniel, I would not think that you're old enough to have watched Leave It to Beaver.
Hey, I have learned to stick around the people older and wiser than I am.
I do the same thing.
Learn as much as I possibly can.
Absolutely.
And yes.
Absolutely.
I think to summarize the Eddie Haskell effect, you can say additionally over-promising and under-delivering, I think is, a red flag. One of the things that the hospital that I worked at, I was speaking with a hospitalist that worked there, and he had mentioned to me that the first red flag that he noticed was the new owners, the private equity owners, came in, and instead of directly depositing funds into their bank accounts, they switched to issuing paper checks, which eventually over time would bounce for non-sufficient funds. Additionally, I think as anesthesia providers, something that clinicians should be concerned about is abnormally large or inflated hourly wages. I think that if the hospital has had some concerns, you might see some of those hefty paychecks to begin with. But then my experience has been that there's a pretty good propensity that at some point you'll be having to fight to get reimbursed.
We didn't get to come to y'all's lecture, so sorry. We were stuck in this booth podcast taping, but I understand that you guys shared some pretty powerful firsthand stories. Would you like to share those with our audience today?
Yeah, so I'd love to share, this is part of how Jennifer and I connected, were our similar stories. I guess you could call it trauma bonding in a way. I had worked in a leadership role in Massachusetts, and this was really has become the textbook private equity takeover case with Steward Healthcare. And back in 2010, Cerberus Capital Management, which is a private equity firm, interestingly named after a three-headed dog that guards the gates of Hades in Greek mythology, so very darkly ironic, right? They acquired a struggling Catholic nonprofit firm called Caritas Christi in Massachusetts. They renamed it Steward Healthcare and then turned it to a for-profit status, and they backed that with a leverage buyout. Now, that's an important part of the private equity playbook because they're relying largely on debt and banking on debt to make a really risky initial investment, like 70 to 80%. And usually only 20 to 30% of that is private equity money. So with Steward Healthcare, this became financial engineering, and the next step of that playbook is in 2016, they sold the land right out from underneath the real estate and the property right out from underneath those hospitals to Medical Properties Trust. And that's called a sale leaseback. So that's the next important component of the playbook is now you've saddled that hospital with debt and lease payments that they're not going to really recover from. That provides a great injection of cash into the system for the investors, and they're going to use that to roll up, meaning they're going to go out and buy more practices. In fact, Steward did buy 18 more at that time and became the largest for-profit system in the United States.
Wow. And just so our listeners understand, when we're talking about leverage, anytime you're investing, you have the potential, with a capital P, of making more money potentially if you're leveraging. So let me give you an example. You go buy a house. The house is $1 million. You put 10% down. You've got $100,000 in it. Property prices are increasing dramatically in that area. You do a few updates. You then sell the house for $1.5 million. All right. Well, on paper, you made $500,000 on $1 million investment, right? But how much money did you have in it? You only had $100,000 of your own money. So you made 500% on that. So that's the power of leverage when you're talking about leverage buyouts. And that's how these PE firms return so much investment back to their shareholders or investors. So it's an interesting phenomenon that I don't think a lot of people understand. And leverage can have the potential, but it also has tremendous amounts of risk, Daniel, just like you said, because if something changes, if something moves, if the market shifts and goes the wrong way, and you're leveraged 70, 80%, that's when you get in trouble. And I think that's what a lot of your stories are going to come from today, is the market in anesthesia has shifted.
That's right. The labor costs have increased substantially. We're working with razor-thin margins in healthcare now. And in the meantime, this company may be saddled with this leverage buyout. So they're leveraged in terms of rent payments, but also consultant and management fees that are being charged by the private equity firm as part of their portfolio. In the meantime, their staffing is being consolidated. Their resources, their equipment, their vendor payments are changing. They're working with typically what is cheapest and easiest to access, or nothing at all. And in the case of Steward, there are many days in which providers had arrived to the facility and there was missing equipment, critical pieces of equipment, also essential pieces of equipment, as essential as and simple as toilet paper.
That's pretty essential.
It's pretty essential, as we learned in the pandemic, right? Yes, very essential, but as critical as embolization or coiling devices.
And things that, may be nefarious and that we might not, I suspect we don't think about on a daily basis as anesthesia providers. When I had drawn attention to the specific concerns that I had at the hospital, I sent a letter to the Illinois Department of Public Health. The Illinois Department of Public Health came to the facility and cited the hospital with 4 immediate jeopardy citations. One of those citations was for not having blood products. Well, I was administering anesthesia, and certainly if there had been, an issue, I would have not thought twice that certainly there would have been sufficient blood products. I think that this topic is especially important because we as clinicians go to our facilities because we want to take care of patients. Might be in a dire situation that you quickly find out that the emergency equipment that you have is not available. Additionally, one of the things that private equity firms tend to do in terms of their hospital platforms is they really seek out to target vulnerable populations, underserved populations. And so when the financial consequences become apparent, they will seek state assistance, which all sounds like a good idea. And of course, stakeholders within the community are interested in providing that assistance. The problem is that because they're private equity or for-profit, there is no 990 that's formed. And so that transparency completely is lacking. And so legislators or stakeholders that think that they're doing something in good faith to help these underserved populations might find their money is not really being invested in patients and the hospital itself.
So you've talked about overarching issues that can happen. I bet there are day-to-day issues outside of toilet paper that you're seeing a problem with.
Yeah, one of the issues that I was privy to information about was that a patient had come in, had a hip fracture, required the orthopedic rep to come with a prosthesis. Because there had been such significant delays in payment, the vendor would not deliver the prosthetic to the hospital facility until in the parking lot, they received a check from the hospital for payment. So, concerns, for patients that, like I said, they're going to the hospital for care and are none the wiser, unfortunately.
Well, I just also want to reiterate, I mean, we're talking about some of the downsides to private equity, but private equity, not all private equity is the same. There are some anesthesia groups out there that are PE-backed that are doing a fine job and doing great. We are not saying that every PE firm is not.
Absolutely.
But, they're also looking to make a profit, and they're looking to turn this a lot of times, Daniel, as you said, within 3 to 7 years. So they package it up and they make it look really pretty so they can turn the profit. And sometimes, that can lead to underlying fundamentals not being there. And I think that's what we're hearing here is, how are they skipping out on those underlying fundamentals?
And those underlying fundamentals, oftentimes these private equity folks, they don't have a healthcare background. A state out on the East Coast that's proposing legislation that hospital administrators would need additional licensure to sit in the C-suite, which is kind of an interesting idea. As licensed and credential professionals ourselves, I think we can understand and appreciate how cumbersome licensure becomes. But I do think it's an interesting proposal, perhaps, in terms of addressing these issues.
I agree, Jeremy. Not all private equity is harmful. So, in many small groups, PE actually can bring stability, some resources, some improved recruitment. Some CRNAs work in PE-backed facilities that still prioritize patient safety and autonomy. The issue arises when financial return becomes the mission and not patient care.
So let's say you know about some of these issues. What role do whistleblowers and frontline workers play in holding these corporations accountable?
Speaking for myself in my own story, one of the things that I initially did was I spoke to some of the board members that sat on the board of directors, thinking that there would be some power in the sitting board for the hospital. It took several months for me to understand that board was actually more of a board that was for credentialing. They were not the boss of the CEO, which is very contrary to sitting on the AANA board, for instance. And so one of the board members had asked me to send them a letter outlining my concerns. To be honest, the board didn't really do a whole lot. I think workers are very vulnerable in these particular circumstances. In my story, it became very public. That letter went public and the community became involved. So I actually think community awareness is more leverage than some of the formal infrastructure that are in place. Absolutely, the DOJ, the Department of Labor all have resources and whistleblower and key tom information, but my experience has been that those are all very difficult, lengthy, costly pathways to traverse.
Yeah, so just listening to this, there's got to be, if you're a practitioner, you're working in one of these facilities, obviously there's ethical issues I'm hearing here. Are there any legal issues? Maybe your malpractice? Just kind of thinking through that, what should clinicians be concerned about in that scenario?
Well, that's a good point. Aside from documenting the unsafe conditions, refusing unsafe assignments and really drawing the line and speaking up, you mentioned malpractice, which Steward has an interesting component to because it's often untalked about. It's one of the lingering, most devastating yet underreported consequences of Steward's collapse was also the collapse of its malpractice carrier, which was Traco. So Steward, if you recall, had moved this from the Cayman Islands to Panama for tax breaks. Right. And in the meantime, they did not use this fund as it was intended. That fund is to pay out malpractice claims, right? But they had raided the coffers of this malpractice carrier to actually pay off invest in hospitals from Utah all the way to Colombia. And when Traco had failed, thousands of clinicians lost liability coverage. And by the end of it, there was only about $3.5 million in the bank, in that piggy bank that had been stuffed with IOUs, meant to pay out over $200 million and over 500 in claims that still have not been paid out. And it has rendered their clinicians, in this case, extremely vulnerable.
Absolutely. And this is one of those scenarios for all of our CRNAs listening that we encourage every CRNA, whether you're independent practice, whether you're working for a group, you're working for a hospital, You need to get a copy of that malpractice policy, have it evaluated, and understand it. I mean, I remember John Fetcho being on with us years ago and telling the story about this clinician who had something happen at the hospital. She thought everything was fine. She leaves and she tries to get credentialed somewhere else. And all of a sudden they say, well, you've got something on your record for a settlement. She said, I didn't do that. They settled on her behalf. She didn't even know it. I mean, so everyone should understand, and believe me, I've read these malpractice. I have my own malpractice. You cannot understand it, which is a great segue for A&A Insurance Services. These folks will help you review it, and they've got your back. I mean, we've seen that, when insurance companies have failed, how A&A Insurance Services have stepped in. I'm not saying they're the end-all, be-all, but by gosh, they're your entity and they are going to support you. So make sure you understand that for situations just like this, Daniel. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can testify to that firsthand, the role that A&A Insurance Services plays in cases just like this, because you're right. A lot of providers in this case had gone to credential at a new facility, and that's when they found out. So you really do need to verify who provides your malpractice coverage, whether it's occurrence or claims made. Is there a tail needed on that? Understand how your work is being billed and coded for on your NPI number and what's being reported.
It's just wild. I mean, it's things that as a clinician, you guys are nurses by background. Unless you just have some business acumen, it's like everything is taken care of, even if you're a W-2, and you got to investigate that. I mean, I say this in just a little bit, but you guys are the goose that laid the golden egg, and if something happens to the goose, there are no more golden eggs. Right? I mean, that's just the way it works.
Eddie Haskell, golden egg.
We
don't know where we're going this morning, right?
We've got it all here, folks. So, Jennifer, how did you uncover patterns of preventable deaths linked to private equity practices, which is a little alarming?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I was employed there as a clinician from January of 2023 through about February of 2024. And after the acquisition in July of 2023, I started noticing, concerning issues regarding our urology specialists no longer were staffed there because they had checks that were returned for non-sufficient funds. And as I think our clinicians will understand, our OB-GYNs then stopped doing procedures because there was no longer a urologist on staff. So things slowly began falling apart. I began to formalize my concerns by writing letters. As I mentioned earlier, my letters drew a lot of attention, I think, and uncovered that was not favorable or appreciated by the C-suite. And so I was no longer working at the facility.
By choice?
No, not by choice.
Mutual separation?
Mutual separation. But I mentioned earlier when I made my introduction that I sit in a unique position as the elected coroner. And so our mission is to investigate preventable death. And so in February of 2025, there was a very unique circumstance where a young woman was admitted to that hospital facility. She eloped from her room and was eloped from her room, yes. She didn't elope for marriage. She eloped from her room and was found on the hospital rooftop, suffered hypothermia and was demised, which was very unfortunate. So the two worlds intersected once again, and because now this is a coroner's investigation.
Wow, what a spot to be in.
So one of the interesting things was that upon my departure from the hospital facility, there was some legal engagement between myself and the hospital facility. And when this coroner's case happened, as a result, we actually have the sheriff's office that is now doing an independent inquest into this particular case because there was a conflict of interest. And I think for community members, of course, we want a transparent, non-biased, investigation. But I can say that there were some concerning issues that were brought to my attention as a result of this young woman passing away.
Wow. So what if CRNAs or residents are working in a situation, they uncover some of these things, what can they do? Obviously, to your point, it was a mutual separation, but a lot of CRNAs don't want to lose their job. They're scared. What do they do, Jen?
I think that it's really important to bring this information to light. In the state of Illinois, out of about 90 hospitals, there historically were about 16 for-profit hospitals. another private equity entity came in and just put in a request to change 9 not-for-profit hospitals to for-profit hospitals. And I think it's important as providers, as we step into leadership positions, that we understand how vulnerable and potentially dangerous that becomes, and to speak out about those things. The problem with that is that the more shares that they get in the market, then the more desirous it is for governments to come in and step in and rescue. And it, once again, without any accountability. So I think that it's important for folks to understand and appreciate this. I, as Daniel said, would make sure you draw the line when it comes to practicing in unsafe conditions. It sounds like maybe you have something you want to add to that, Daniel.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is if Wall Street wants to profit off patients, the least we can do is demand full transparency. You cannot regulate what you cannot see, and you cannot fix what no one's tracking. So part of it is just being increasingly aware that this is going on and educating the public, which is exactly what we're doing right now. And then there are some regulatory processes that we need to really strongly consider. One of the most important that I think we don't talk about enough is closing the carried interest tax loophole. So when, after a few years, we talked about these private equity firms essentially flipping these health systems like they're flipping a house, right? Or turning over a lemonade stand, and it's not that simple. But because of the nature, those investors are taxed at the capital gains tax rate of 20%. They're not taxed at the income tax rate of 37%, even though they used other people's money and not their own. And it's called the carried interest loophole. Neither Joe Biden nor Donald Trump have been able to close this. And the challenging part about this and the cold reality is 88% of Congress gets PE money. And so doing that is legislatively extremely difficult.
Yeah. I mean, that is amazing, that 88%. But that explains why this hasn't changed. And until there is a cultural change or a call from constituents, it's not going to change.
That's right.
And, you know, it is interesting. I mean, you know, you hear the good and the bad with it. I mean, you know, we're a capitalistic society. Should that be there? Are these people perpetuating, you know, good business and bringing jobs? And there's all kinds of on both sides of this. But, you know, this is definitely a negative that we're hearing about it. And I mean, there are negatives to it as well. So why is it important for CRNAs to be involved in advocacy and talking, like you guys are here today, and talking about issues like this?
I was really naive to understanding what private equity was. And so when I started seeing some of these red flags, you know, I think, as Daniel mentioned, our trauma bonding, it was helpful because I wasn't really understanding and appreciating what was happening. But the further I was digging, I had a greater appreciation for what the formula is and that this is not unusual. There is a very organized script. So I think that's really important to understand.
Quite frankly, I think the cost of being silent is just way too high. Our patients are at risk here. We are our biggest advocates for patients at times where they're vulnerable and they cannot speak for themselves or stand up for themselves. And by nature, we have a responsibility to stand up for patient care. This is morally injurious. You know that cutting these corners, working with equipment that is broken or unsafe, or being pushed to work faster at an expense, it's morally injurious, and professional ethics just erode in this process. But when we show up, when we document, when we advocate, we make a strong impact, and we can deliver that safe care for our patients.
So listen, we want to thank you both. Both are extremely involved in the CRNA community. Thank you for all your work and all you're doing and your hard work. I mean, both of you just are the epitome of advocacy and working in the best interest of CRNAs, and we just want to thank you for that. Sometimes you're in a tough position in that as well, but you're doing a great job. And thanks for being on the show with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Sharon, I think it's a wrap.
I think so.
Thank you for tuning in to Beyond the Mask. If you enjoy the show and want to help us grow, the best way to support us is simple. Leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, share the show on social media, and tell your friends. Your word of mouth is what keeps us going strong. We're proud to consistently rank in the top 50 medical podcasts nationwide and to be #1 in the CRNA community. All thanks to listeners like you. Your support helps us stay there, and we couldn't do it without you. We'll see you on the next Beyond the Mask.